And there's 2 points that I want to highlight that maybe you know, maybe you don't know. I don't know what's discussed before, but one of the bigger issues in the fines and fees discussion was Pew was interested in why Louisiana had the most open probation files in the country. Not incarceration rates, not the other stuff. It's why are there so many probation files? And why is a probation officer, I think the average, and I'm making up numbers to a degree, I think the average is like 10 open files, and Louisiana had like 40 open files on one probation officer. And Pew's position was this was causing lots of problems, because if a probation officer can only has to manage 40 files, he's not doing his real true calling as a probation officer, which is making sure you're not using drugs, that you're getting a job, you're doing all the other things. He's got too many files to do that. And he's spending, they found out, most of his time collecting fines and fees in Louisiana. And that really was the driver of the fines and fees legislation, was how can we reduce probation files for these guys? And so that became the impetus for this bill. I mean, there is also the economic part of, well, you don't want to reincarcerate somebody because they can't pay, and that was I don't want to say secondary, but that was not necessarily the focus, because what Pew was looking at was at a macro level of numbers. And they're seeing, where's Louisiana out of place on numbers? And so that's really what it came down to, and that's where they realized that Louisiana had an issue. And they realized the issue was fines and fees, because what would happen is people go in court, and the judge would say, have you paid your fines and fees? No, I'm not going to put you in jail, because that would be mean and cruel and everything else. I'm just going to extend your probation until you pay your fines and fees. And that became the thing, and so they stack up, they stack up, they stack up, they stack up, they stack up. And so you had a whole bunch of files, and then probation officers actually testified to this, that they kept one stack on their desk of fines and fees, and one stack on their desk for people they were actually actively monitoring. So it's like, well, how can we get rid of these other ones off their desk? So that was the driver of this. And then, so we had an initial bill that was filed, and the judges came and the DAs came and said, well, this doesn't work. So we made about 50 concessions to the Judges and DAs Association about what they wanted it to look like. And so we made those. And one of your brethren, Jules Edwards, was really a driver of those changes. He said a lot of revisions and stuff like that. We accepted about half of them. The ones we did accept weren't accepted because they wouldn't solve the probation issue. When you looked at them, they would crunch the numbers on these issues, and they said, well, this is not going to lead to the results we want. So those are the ones we didn't accept. There's still some concern over, okay, this could theoretically bankrupt the system, though. If we're not getting our fines and fees, we don't have a unified court system. This is a driver how we fund all these things, and we definitely don't want that to happen, which I agreed. So we issued into a compromise, which was we were going to delay the implementation of Act 260, get some numbers back on how much fines and fees we're actually paying for the court system, and then go work from there. So then we created a task force. We delayed the implementation for a year, created a task force, judges, DAs, advocates, anybody who expressed an interest.
Bail.
Bail, everybody. And then we kept, every time we kept adding new members to this thing. And so we kept growing, and every person who wasn't on the initial task force accused the panel of, well, clearly you're out to get us because we're not representing the panel. Like, no, we're just not that thoughtful. We did our best, but we are human beings, and we don't know that this entity has an interest in this. So we kept expanding out. But if you want to be on there, here. And then they didn't show up to any of the meetings, which is like always, the fun of these things. Well, what we learned at that point was the task force met. We engaged a legislative auditor to find out information on how much fines and fees. And I want to be very respectful when I say this, but the legislative auditor came back very quickly and said, this task cannot be completed. And we're deeply concerned about the state of the court system in Louisiana, because this is actually, we didn't realize this going in, it's ripe for fraud. It would only take an enterprising clerk or an enterprising sheriff's deputy, depending on the jurisdiction, and they could steal millions of dollars and nobody can catch them in the system. And
This was something that people didn't want to hear because they don't really want to believe that this is a reality. But these guys are auditors, they're accountants, they know. They said, this is why it is. I know every system works differently, but for the purposes of this conversation, let's just say that the sheriff collects the fees in your jurisdiction. The sheriff collects it. He puts it in a pot, and then he disperses it out from his pot. Or she, yes. Thank you. I guess Orleans does have a female. I'm so used to seeing males. She disperses it out to the various entities according to what she believes is the correct distribution, because in Louisiana we don't have a uniform distribution system on how this stuff is collected. So the problem is when the money comes in, it's never coded. And since it's never coded, we can't see if this is going here, here, or here. It could go to a bank account here, and we cannot connect the dots between the two. So that's what led to a fee schedule being created through the legislative auditor and the Supreme Court. Was now this stuff has to be identified on the front end so that we can track it through the system and see where the money is going. So now it's like this thing that we started with probation files has turned into something completely different, which is we need to have audit measures in the state of Louisiana for these local jurisdictions. And look, I tell everybody, and I'm not going to denigrate anybody where they're from, some places do it great. I mean, some people are really good at accounting. And if you've been in other places in Louisiana, it's downright scary what takes place in these court systems, and you don't know. Second of all, secondary issue in all of this is, again, with no unified distribution model, everybody was taking a different tact. So in some jurisdictions, say the guy owes $1,000, he pays $100. What do you do with the $100? Who does it go to? Does it go to the court? Does it go to the DA? Does it go to the sheriff? Does it go to the public defender's office? Or is it split out pro rata? A lot of jurisdictions are pro rata, but not all. So herein lies the other problem is, and then who's deciding what the pro rata is? Basically, it's really coming down to people who are working in the sheriff or clerk's office, depending on jurisdictions, or agreement of parties and stuff like that. That's not the correct way to do it. So we have the schedule created, and then we started wanting to collect more data, which is what they started asking y'all for. And the Supreme Court kind of started getting more involved in collecting the data at this point to see how much money is coming in. We are now, I think, starting to get, this is a long way of me telling you that we're only now, 5 years later, getting a true system-wide financial system in place. Now, of course, because COVID came, I mean, we had hurricanes, one thing after another delayed the implementation of a lot of things, the reporting of a lot of things. So we're now only like 6 years, 7 years later, starting to see the data actually come in, and how much money is really being paid by fines and fees, who's paying it, where is it coming from, those kind of things are trickling in. Meanwhile, we were extending out the life of the panel and extending out the life of Act 260 implementation of it while we collect this financial data. Everybody started getting frustrated, nobody more frustrated than myself, that Act 260 was sitting in limbo for all these years. Probably the only second person was next to me as far as the frustration of Act 260. And we got approached by the Judges and DA Association probably last year before session. It was like, look, we would like some resolution to all this stuff hanging out there. These are the things we can agree to on a sheet of paper. If we do these changes to Act 260, we'll let it be implemented, and we think that this is a good compromise. That we looked at it, and in all frankness, what they proposed made Act 260 irrelevant. And so it was like, well, look, I appreciate the good faith offer, because I think it was a good faith offer, but in reality, big picture, it destroyed Act 260. And so I said, we need these. I will take these things, but you need to move on these 4 items over here. And so they did. And to their credit, they said, okay, we can work with that. And so then Act 260 passed, modified. And as somebody who's seen this thing through the process, this is a heavily compromised bill. And I mean, working with stakeholders, working with both sides, having her yell at me because it didn't go far enough.
I didn't raise my voice.
It was emotional yelling. It wasn't physically yelling. That it wasn't going far enough, and having DAs and not all, and having certain judges saying it's going too far, and trying to find that sweet spot where, look, we don't all love it, but we can all live with this, which is the act of a true compromise, right? We tell everybody when they go into mediation as lawyers, like, you're not going to walk out happy, but you're going to walk out okay. That's where I think Act 260 really truly is right now. And now we get to see what happens. We get to test it out over a couple years, see if there's, people always, I think it's kind of funny to me as a legislator, like, well, this is blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, that's cool. Like, this isn't some like baby of mine that I believe is perfect. This is an attempt to change policy. And I fully expect, as a policymaker, there'll be unintended consequences that we need to fix, that some of the ideas that we had were wrong, and that need to be changed. But maybe we'll get something right, or we may learn that, hey, this is very close to working the way we envisioned it. It needs to be tweaked here. And so I don't like, the emotional reaction that I get from people, not because I'm personally offended by it. I just think it inhibits true progress. And I think if we can put emotion aside and say, look, let's look at it. And if it doesn't work, let's scrap the whole thing in 5 years. Like, I get all that, and maybe it is, but how are we ever going to get better as a state, as a judicial system, as lawyers, as judges, if we don't take attempts at improving the system, right? If we just accept the status quo all the time as the only avenue of this is the way it has to be because this is the way we've always done it, we know it works, but then we're like, does it? And then so, but that's kind of my topic of it, so I'm always open to criticism. I think it's healthy. I think we need to look at it, but I want it to be, for me personally, I want it couched in data. I don't want like your one story of the one guy who came to court who it didn't work out for, because that's how bad policy made, right? I mean, what the bad case is always creates bad facts create bad law, right? We all know that, and that's the fact. So if you want to show me policy numbers and big data and macros and stuff like that, I'm all in. Like let's change it. I'm gonna shut it up for yes.
I have do you mind taking a question?
Yeah, no.
It's a stupid question, but I'm gonna ask a stupid question. What's the replacement? Is the legislature going to, or has the legislature allocated funding to the courts to replace what was lost by way of collection?
That's a great question, and that's what the audit financial trails were trying to figure out, is what is that number? Because you couldn't trust, and look, I love the people who come talk to me. Some of the people are dear friends. But when you're motivated financially, and I'm not saying you're making a personal gain out of it, and I think their concerns are real. I've always said that. But what's the judge in Jefferson Parish? The retired judge. Ansari. I mean, if you listen to Ansari, it's $8 billion. I mean, and I'm like, Judge, I love you. I've been to your fishing camp with you, but it ain't $8 billion. Like, let's get a real price tag on this. And the idea with the task force was to find out what that number was once we had all the financial picture, and then start looking at replacement funding. Now, I never liked, I like the idea of state general fund funding, but that's not necessarily, I think, the most stable, and B, the most, it's not the most stable, and it's going to be the most difficult to prove, right, on an annual basis. So I always wanted to do something that had some sort of annual funding for y'all. So what I always would, with that number, say the number, and let's just, is $100 million. Why don't we put a medical marijuana tax or a recreational tax on marijuana and give you a percentage of that equals out to $100 million? That way the state's stepping back from it we're not controlling, I didn't like your opinion, Judge. You really hosed me the other day in court. I'm going to the legislature and you're going to feel the burn. Like, I don't like that.
My question was kind of similar on her lines, is because I sat and watched the committee task force, and I know how much y'all were getting pulled. My question is you through the process, you saw how much our courts are basically reliant upon fines and fees to pay, and the kind of the user pay system, and our monies come from the local governments, and as an equal branch of government, I don't know if that should be the right thing. And you just kind of touched on it, like the state general fund ought to give something back, but as you pull away those fines and fees, where is that replacement going to be? And so if I have a hole, and I know I let Ansari run with it, I sat in the back and let him grab your ear, at least on this bill, but yeah, there is a number and that we're going to lose, and I like the policy decision too. I think it's a good decision, right? I know that's what you've been fighting for, is to move that off of the backs of some of those individuals, but the state needs to step in. So is that your kind of that medical idea?
That was my idea, and then I got killed in another bill, which was I wanted to create the Office of Justice Funding in the state of Louisiana as a repository for this money so that it could be dispersed with a person to dispersing the money. And I think it's still a good idea. It needs to be revisited because it's hard to have money just being straight into locals without a place kind of like, hey, money goes here, 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 here. So I wanted to create an overarching agency, a small agency, not like LDH.
Different from the Supreme Court?
Different from the Supreme Court. Because the issue with the Supreme Court is, how do I say this tactfully? The issue with the Supreme Court is often up to the justices who are elected at that time how much they want to be involved in these issues, right? Like public defender used to be in the Supreme Court, and then they're like, we don't want that. Like it's so sometimes you have justices who want to be involved in these issues, and then you also run into the same problem with the Supreme Court. I mean, it's an elected body too, and it's I know it's the same branch, but I'm not sure you always want them controlling all the funding either. I mean, I'm not sure that's always. I mean, our founders envisioned checks and balances for a reason, and I'm not sure I like the idea of one person at the Supreme Court deciding how much a district judge in home is getting for his courthouse. So I think there's places where, and look, I'm open to any idea. And I say that as an advocate, more of an advocate for the lower level judges than I do as an advocate for the legislature. And so I think all those things are kind of playing in. And I think we can all agree. I mean, I've never heard somebody disagree with the statement. You know, the fee on the public. Right. And I don't believe that. I honestly don't believe that. But I can't dispute his feeling. I mean, that's a valid feeling that he has. And that's not what we want to do as a society. And look, I don't know that the public defenders are getting that much money from the fee on felonies. On traffic tickets, yes. But on felonies, it's probably next to nothing. So why is it there? So one of the things, too, is like, I know I really want you to talk. I apologize. Why is it if I get convicted in Iberia versus Baton Rouge, why do I, and look, I get that maybe the systems are different, but why do I have different fees? Why is stealing a boat in Iberia maybe cost me $1,000, and I'm making up the numbers, and $5,000 in Baton Rouge? That's not equitable justice.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to your clerks, and each time they have a court cost, it's a local bill, and it tacks on an extra $4 here or there.
Is anybody from Lafayette here?
Go for it.
So, ish, right? So everybody knows Lafayette's courthouse is terrible.
It is.
It's an accepted fact. And the judges there have wanted a new courthouse for forever, and so they put up a tax, and people in Lafayette right now are feeling very anti-tax, so they keep killing the tax, and they don't want to pay for it, right? So what do? They came to the legislature and asked for a criminal fee to pay for the courthouse. Now, that's a public responsibility. It's not one section of the it's a civil, first of all, it's a civil courthouse, it's not just a criminal courthouse. We all know the courthouse is a reception of documents, and I mean, this is a true public function. And so what happened? It came to the legislature. One of the judges who's a big proponent of the bill, of the fee, because she wants a new courthouse, and I'm not against her getting a new courthouse. Well, none of her local legislators are going to stand in opposition of a local judge who wants a fee to build a new courthouse. So they are going to file the bill, and they're going to be advocates for it across the board. I get that. That's politics, right? We have a rule in the legislature. It's not a formal rule. It's an informal rule. I don't mess with your local bills. You don't mess with my local bills, right? And that's a good rule 99% of the time, to be honest with you. Because I know Homa, you don't. Stay out of my business, right? But in this scenario, it's terrible. So I have to sit in a committee, which I know this is a bad idea, and with a guy that's my good friend, and say, I don't like this bill, and I'm going to break the long-standing tradition and custom of Louisiana's legislature. No, I'm not. I'm going to do the political thing, because 99% of the time it is the right thing, and keep my mouth shut. And that passes, and all of a sudden now you have a new fee in Lafayette that you don't have in Terrebonne Parish, which is a criminal court fee to build a new criminal courthouse. How is that fair? It's not.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think I should let you talk. I've talked for forever.
Good morning. My name is Sarah. And first, let me just start by also saying that Tanner definitely downplayed the amount that he was pulled and stretched and jabbed and attacked from every side.
Oh, yeah, it's fun.
No one was happy. Which, again, to his point, though, means that hopefully something good could come out of Act 260. I think from having seen it in its 2017 version and all of the delays as an advocate, it was very much for me, we have to start somewhere. And I think the most dangerous thing that I've heard from the legislature is we need to wait, we're not ready, or this is not possible without a unified court system, a unified clerk system, these other things that are going to actually stand in the way of progress and potentially just taking that very first step. And so we also saw it with other legislation that we were doing, basically saying, like, this is impossible until this other thing happens. Well, if we put that to the side and that impossible other thing is not considered, what could you actually do within the system that exists, I think is really important for us. So we represent individuals in the post-conviction phase. We don't do public defense or open criminal matters, but anyone with contact with the criminal legal system, with the collateral consequences that come with it, we work to address criminal fines and fees, driver's license suspensions, court debts, things like that, because we see basically how those tax individuals and extract wealth from full communities. So that's sort of where we were coming from, and specifically with Act 260, when the Commission on Justice System funding started, for us it was also really an attempt to try and deep dive into what is the data, what is the information, what is actually happening on the ground, wherein a person with a $25 seatbelt ticket could potentially walk out of a traffic court with almost $300 in a court cost. What was that? Can we break it down? And can we find in the civil system, in our civil law system, where all of those fees are actually being tacked on, one after the other after the other? And it's a computer fee, an off-duty witness fee, a clerk fee, a DA fee, a percentage of this and that. And so the ability to then sit and advocate for and say, we get that some of these fees are very, very necessary. In a user-funded system, until there's replacement funding, you are not going to get out from under this and completely undo or break the system. But why is an individual getting a certain fee if no witness was ever going to be called? Or why is there a postage fee when nothing is mailed? And these are, and that's how, when you think about it, and how you can nickel and dime somebody, that's potentially where it really is starting from, is all of those little pieces. And I think to Tanner's point as well, one of the first things we found was, again, there's a $12.50 conviction fee in one North Shore parish, and it's $50 in another place. It's just a bad look to say that it's going to cost more to be convicted in one parish than another, in one court or system than another. So yes, we were always asking one more thing. But I think where we are now is an interesting conversation too, and what I think the next step is going to be is, with more information and more data from the Supreme Court, what is the reality? What actually is happening when judges are starting to implement ability to pay decisions? And so I think for us too, it's also the education and the advocacy around your first question with a felony conviction under Act 260 should be, can this person pay right now, yes or no? No further question than that. Can you pay right now? And if that answer is no, i.e., you had a public defender, we already figured this out, you are on SNAP benefits or TANF or receiving disability, this is how efficient the system could be. You can stop right there and say, listen, if something changes and you go win lotto, the DA can bring this back. And you can have a hearing in a year and say, this man just, or woman just inherited money, got a job, good things are now happening, they can now come back and afford to pay. Let's revisit this.
Well, that gets us a little into the weeds, right? So
sure.
From the practical standpoint, that's what slide back over. Judge Schlegel was
yeah.
on Tanner a whole lot leading up to it, and then sorry, I kind of stayed out. I let him handle it. But the ability to pay hearing, our push was to make it 90 days later instead of right there, because practically, you're going to see, as all the judges here, whenever somebody's standing in front and says, I want to take a deal, I'm going to plead, the judge says, can you pay? Yeah, I'm going to pay, because they want the deal.
Right.
So they're always most likely going to say yes.
And so that's
If-
education
if-
on the other side to
if
say
the
no.
answer- If the answer is no, I know a lot of judges might say, well, then there's no deal. Well, start to drop, call you first witness. And so that was kind of the practical point. I know looking in the paper it goes, because there's two different things. You look from a policy and that sounds great, but from our pushback, to the certain extent it was a pushback, was what does it actually mean for the judges in the courtroom? Like, what are we going to have to now do differently? And I think that was a lot of the discussion that was tried to show. Not that the policy in which y'all are pushing was wrong, because again, I've said it, I believe with your policy, is how is it going with the way it's currently written, how are we going to make that work? Have y'all seen that too?
Yeah, my question is a little bit different
Yeah.
in this way. What is the legislature doing?
I don't know.
To address what really for me amounts to then an issue of inequitable penalties or punishments for commission of the same crime.
That's a good question, and we and her worked on this last session. So one of the things we did is we have the Supreme Court. Is it who's on that task force creating that? We created another task force. So that's what the legislature likes to do. She supplied like 90% of the language. I changed about 10% of the language
For judicial counsel.
for judicial counsel. So one of the things we're looking at, because I brought up the issue that I raised to you about we don't get involved in local bills, and the Supreme Court's supposed to actually weigh in on this stuff through the judicial council. Like the fees are supposed to go through them. They're supposed to come and give us the blessing. But what enterprising people have done in the legislature is they've said, pass this fee contingent on judicial council approval. And then it created the situation where the judicial council was like, well, the legislature already passed it. We're going to approve it. So then like we just rendered the whole process ridiculously. I mean, that's when you look at like a bad bureaucracy, that is like a great example of a bad bureaucracy, right? We took a process that was supposed to limit the fees and make sure they're only tied to what they're supposed to be done. We kept the bureaucracy there, but it's completely obsolete, and just everything gets rubber checked along the way at the very end with no real oversight. So we were trying to address that. So we created a task force with the Supreme Court to work on it. I met with them. Were you on that Zoom?
No, it's I think a couple other public defenders, but not me. No.
So I had a Zoom with me the other day, and they're trying to wrestle with this concept as well. And basically, what we're saying is there needs to be, and I don't know what the total outcome of the task force is going to be, but in broad terms, there needs to be a statewide schedule of fees that you can charge this, and then allow for a variation by a reasonable variation by jurisdiction, because you have to take into account New Orleans is not Houma, right? I mean, we can't have the exact same. $100 in Houma is not the same as $100 in New Orleans. I mean, that's just reality of the situation. $100 in Houma is not the same as $100 in Bunkie either. I mean, so there needs to be some variation, but these are what we allow, and this is what you can do, and this is how you can variate from it. And so we tasked them, I think, they're going to create a schedule of what that looks like as a guideline for them as the judicial council to make policy decisions on that issue. Does that make sense?
And I think the concern there also is the question, and what we would always raise is this just going to be a race to the top? So if it was $750 in one parish but $50 in the other, are we at risk of making everyone $50, right? And so this is, and I think this was the pushback from advocates, was there's danger there too, right? And so like when you are looking at this and trying to determine what the true cost is without enough data to support the cost of running the criminal legal system locally, you're not sure, right? How much of the $750 conviction fee is going to whatever function the court has? Is it keeping the lights on, or is it, buying like better bonded paper for when you print off like certifications or I don't know,
and
right?
I think you have a constitutionality issue too. If the fee is no longer attached to the service, or it's never attached to the service that's being provided, I think it's a tax.
Yes.
And if it didn't get 70% in the legislature to pass it, then it's an unconstitutional tax at that point.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So Kelly brings up, and he was questioning the practical aspects of it. And part of the issue that I actually see, I've actually had to do a couple of these actual hearings. And they don't take all day, but for one hearing, if you're going through forms, go through all of the questions, etc., it might be about 30, 45 minutes. And what I'm finding is, because even in the indigency determination, it's not just a question of tell me what your bills are. And if, I don't know if most of you find, young men, they're not getting benefits, right? Young men don't, it'll be young women, that's just the way that the system is set up. God. But you know it. You know what you're seeing. Because if you're able-bodied, 24-year-old man that can work, even if you don't have that much money, and you're not gonna be able to get your SNAP benefits. But what I'm seeing is, or what it doesn't take into consideration is, the guy that's 24 years old and he buys a Charger. I think I was talking about this the other night. And because of his poor driving record, he pays $1,000 a month. That's his note. Additionally, he's $400 a month in insurance. So the only reason why he doesn't have money is because he has poor, extremely poor spending habits. So when we have he's got a car that he can't afford.
Is it a car that he can't afford, or is it the car he needs to get to work?
It
And
is
that's the
absolutely
opportunity.
Not the car. It is absolutely not the car that he needs to get to work. And I challenge anybody that ends up coming in that courtroom and then tells me that.
Right.
Because and he even knows it. Because I see, and this is what it is. Practically, it's judge, sit down and really have a conversation with the people that are in front of you. It's not a generalization to just say that. It's literally, well, so tell me about this. Tell me about, it's literally, you have to take where it would have been a 2-minute moving it on. You just have to stop and ask some questions, 5 to 7 to 10 more minutes. And you find that when you get these answers, again, I'm finding myself oftentimes, you don't qualify for the public defender, because when I look at the actual schedule and everything that you've told me, everything that you provided to me, if you don't make, I think the number is less than $1,200 a month for an individual without any children, one person, $1,200 a month. All these guys make more than $1,200 a month. Now, that's still no money. I know that. So all I'm left doing is defense continues. You got to get another lawyer. We got to bring you in here with a lawyer. This is on the front end. So by the time I'm on the back end, when I am having a conversation, it was a young lady who was stealing money. This was a guilty plea. She was stealing. It was theft. And when we did the ability to pay hearing, her issue is her credit is so bad, right? She's doing, and she's ending up doing, she's one of the calling or answering the phone calls from home. Y'all know what I'm talking about, call service. She's doing that. And so when I actually had to put her on a payment schedule, and this is what it is, I put her on a payment schedule, it ends up being like $25 a month. That's all it can be. I just say this to say practically what ends up happening is after the hearings, after we go through everything, what's generally happening is I have most people waiving their right to that hearing on the front end, right? And I think we kind of talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I generally have more people having to make these come to Jesus moments with, if you really want to get this done, they're selling that expensive vehicle that they can't afford anyway. They're now going in, or they're trading in. I've had that happen in that one particular case especially. The guy traded in and we got a sensible Civic or something that he can actually afford. And he made a better decision. So he was able to actually get it done. While it's taking longer to get through it, what I'm seeing is just not that, I guess the right-of-way effect. So we're not able to make that determination. I don't think the straight-up indigency determination is as clear-cut as you may think, just because you have the public defender. So, and I guess that's the main.
I think.
We want our judges to be doing. Like, when I think about the criminal justice system and the judges and how we are spending our time, it seems to me that there has to be a better solution to how we are processing people through the system. I listen to Will and think about 45-minute hearings and going through people's decision to make a call that's already been made, probably before.
Sure, before you got that. Yeah.
I wonder, like, at what point is it kind of skewing the administration of justice as it relates to what the judge role is, the prosecutor role is?
Oh, but I already accept that I'm now past so many times. I'm past judge. I'm social worker. I'm counselor. I am financial advisor. I'm accounting. Oh, absolutely. I'm
Right,
doing all
but
that.
some of
can
this-
I put, okay, Mike,
Yeah,
I'm doing all that.
Can I push back on that a little bit, though? Because I've experienced this conversation with a lot of judges. First, two things on this point. First of all, if we're being honest with each other in this room, if you're doing a true indigency screening in the front end, you are the exception, you are not the rule. The rule is, in all of our court systems in Louisiana, is, do you have a private lawyer? No, I appoint a public defender. They can sort that out after. That's the rule. And if anybody says otherwise, I question everything you're going to say after that, because that is the rule.
Come and watch. Well, yeah,
I'm not
you're not saying that y'all saying except. Yeah, but
I'm
I
not
can
saying
say
that is 98% of the courtrooms that I practice
Yeah.
in. Is, do you have a lawyer? Nope. Point the public defender. How much money do you make? Oh, I don't have any money. Okay, no question about the actual finances. I got these cases on my desk. I'm not blaming the judges who do it. This is just, if I was a judge, I'd probably do the same thing. I'm just saying that's the reality. So we're not really doing an indigency determination on the front end. We're doing it, I don't know if we're ever doing it. That's my first comment to that. Second, every time I try to take what Judge Nandi was saying, Nandi? Nandia.
Just not judge, just say.
Oh, sorry.
Just in case I come across you in my practice. No.
Where are you the judge at? No. Every time I try to take that social worker aspect away from a judge and just let them focus on deciding cases, I get the resistance from the judges. That's where it's going to come from. So if y'all want to give it up, I would more than likely want to take it as a policymaker and give it to somebody else. But what happens is the judge feels a loss of control in that situation and rightfully or wrongly says, I'm the best person to make this determination. I don't want anybody else doing it. So I can't feel too sorry for you because I've seen so many judges on so many issues come to me and say, well, I don't want to lose this right to do this.
Yeah, and that judicial discretion is so powerful. I also would push back and just say, and caution, I guess, because I have had this conversation with judges as well, imposing your value structure on these defendants. And I think with the understanding of poverty, the intersections of intergenerational poverty, trauma, the communities that these folks are coming from, making that personal choice is just that, a personal choice. So as a judge, being very careful that whatever your lived experience might have been before you got to the bench, that is going to inform your decisions, and I totally 100% want to respect that. But the minute you're on that bench, the power dynamic shifts, and your economic financial decision-making shifts. That $1,000 charger is not the same to you that it would be to somebody else, but that doesn't diminish the importance of that choice for that person. So I think when you can, if there are clear-cut, very easy decisions to be made about indigency, it's there. Additionally, a lot of the work that we do on the back end with expungements now involves trying to do informa pauperis determinations, which the Supreme Court has recognized the value of your house and the value of a car for a family isn't part of that determination. So it can be whatever car that person has decided to pay for. So, and I've had to really push back on a DA who said, well, I can go get a used car for $3,000 right now. Why is she paying $700 a month, which is the average current payment for just based on interest rates and poor credit? And why does she have $300 in insurance? Less even because of accidents, tickets, or anything else, but just because she has no credit history whatsoever. She's really starting as, you know, a middle-aged African-American woman in New Orleans from a specific point with banks. And when that happens, the district attorney trying to say, well, get her $3,000 and she can go buy any other car. She doesn't have $3,000 all at once. She has the $1,000 right now, and the decisions and the choices that she has to make to feed her family and do all of that each month is going to be the fact that she may never get to $3,000 whole dollars to turn around and hand over for a car at one time. So I would caution that when there is the opportunity to do an indigency determination and say SNAP benefits, or like looking at net income, what are you actually taking home? Separating that from how you choose to spend your money when it comes to what does it take to get you to work, what does it take to get you housed, fed. I think too, the other danger is that we know federal benefits are a benefits cliff. If you make $1,329.01 As a single person, you are not getting SNAP. And so when that question, and also just as a advocate too, all of the poverty guidelines are going up next week. They've
Good.
been announced.
Good.
It is increasing, not a ton, but it's going up a little bit. So we have to acknowledge inflation and those changes year over year. But I think for us, when we ask for those ability to pay determinations, and also again, on that back end, maybe your social work side or the discretion you have as the hat is not letting the person waive that, saying this matters right now, like, because I don't want to see you back here in 3 months that we have to do this again because you've fallen behind, that you are already delinquent, and now we're in a place where these non-payments result in technical violations, right? So we can talk about how you can't be incarcerated for your inability to pay. But what are those driving decisions behind a person's inability to pay? If I pay $25, I get 15 more days. If I pay $50, I get 30 more days. But I have to show up month over month over month at payment hearings and stand before a judge with a collections officer who tells me, why don't you go get a job? What are you doing with your money? That is very demeaning and crippling for all of those defendants to have to stand up every month and say, my kid got sick, my tire went flat, all of those things. So if it's
100% agree with you.
yeah.
And I'd add to that the reason why QVC doesn't sell you a plan for what the true cost of what they're trying to sell you to is because they know you won't buy it.
Right.
If you say 8 installments of $25, I can afford that hairbrush. And it's like, honey, I think giving them a plan, the $25, whatever it is on the front end, actually gets them to buy in to making the payment
Yes.
itself. I think, and actually the stats in Texas bore this out.
Yes.
Texas
Gonna get
did
to that.
this. So people are like, oh, Louisiana versus Texas. Texas has been having this. And what they learned, they were just as afraid as we were to shift. And when they shifted to payment plans, collections went up.
And the cost of collections go down.
I want to hear from, I guess I can hear from both of you, but especially Sarah, because I just want to understand from the advocacy standpoint. As an advocate, you're not opposed to a fine system. It's just the method by which it's collected.
Yes. And I think, so this was the other big piece that where a lot of the justice system funding conversations really centered too. We are very careful in our language. I am not going to fight the criminal legal system on fines. That is a legislative decision that says if it is a $500 fine for littering, for theft, whatever, your fine is a piece to it, and it should be considered in the ability to pay determination decision. My bigger focus and where I think we talk about trying to get justice and equity back into the system is the fees and the costs and the surcharges that take a $500 fine, which a jury or a judge or whoever has imposed, and I will not fight, and just say, can this person pay it? And why walking out the door is it no longer $500? Why is it $1,200? So I think like that conversation and that policy, I do my best to be very careful in my language around restitution is restitution. A fine is a fine. Can you still say the person cannot afford this fine? Yes. And cannot go to jail because they cannot afford this fine? Correct. But it's the other stuff that I want to be realistic in terms of, and unfortunately too right now, the alternative is, and what we want to be careful of is, if I say I can't afford to pay, the default is the payment plan. Act 260 says if I cannot afford to pay, the default, and some people will fall into this category, but it won't be everybody, the default is then waive the fine and waive the fee. If I can afford to pay, then we start the conversation around what is a realistic payment plan for me, and that's your what are you paying, what can you pay, and being really careful that it should not be necessarily a schedule. Everyone shouldn't get a $100 payment plan.
And or it shouldn't be connected to a plea either.
And it definitely needs to be disconnected from any kind of plea. Yeah, so go ahead.
This is a question for both of you as a follow-up, because I'm glad I got the clarification on the advocacy side. I really want to urge the legislature and the advocates to consider the weight that should be given to community service as well as an alternative to the payment. There's not enough emphasis on it. There are not enough opportunities and options for judges to exercise their right or their discretion to say, instead of especially for the indigent person who's on SSI, who only gets $800. I mean, that they're living in poverty. That's
Mhm.
impoverished status per se.
Yeah.
At the same time, the law as it's written has community service woven in, but it's really not able to be acted upon if there isn't fine, first of all, and if there is an emphasis on that as an alternative. So I would urge both of your bodies or your powers to really think about that.
Mhm.
Because it seems to me that can also be a way to drive accountability, and to invest in, the community, or reinvest in the community.
I hear that. I think there are also pitfalls and dangers. So for the person on SSI, recognizing that they are disabled, what are the available opportunities for community service for that person? And it's, if it's there, well, so that is beyond, like, I don't know that the legislature has that power or authority. That's gotta be a community and probably like outside the system driven opportunities to create, here is a location where I can go and fulfill community service that isn't just picking up garbage on the highway or mowing yards or doing, like, that's too physical. What is an alternative that is not going to be physical and or outside the scope of a person's mental capacity if they're on disability? What is available to them then? And I don't know the answer. I hear that. That is a question that I think has to come from communities and local places to say we are willing to take on a community service person and able to meet whatever their needs might be. Garbage pickup is great for some. Not going to knock it. If they want to do it, let them opt into it. Saying that your choices are, here's a payment plan or go pick up garbage. What are people going to
garbage
choose?
Pickup is an interesting point. I'm going to move it a little bit. I know Judge Hunter, we were talking about a little last evening, is some of these statutes in the criminal code have mandatory, and the legislature takes away our discretion. Like say DWI is a perfect one.
Mm-hmm.
If I have somebody on a first offense DWI, it's a $300 fine. It's in the statute. I can't. And half of that litter detail, half of the 32 hours of community service has to be on litter detail. So I know those are different groups, and now you got mad there, and I understand the politics sides of it all, but within the criminal code, all the statutes, the code articles that have a mandatory minimum fine, I wish they would all go away, and you'd have a fine up to $500.
You want to take that on too?
$1,000.
How many more can they come for
Then
you?
I have to give the fine because the statute tells me to. But then y'all have these other policy decides to say take away fines and fees. So now I'm here, it's like, well, he doesn't have the ability to pay the fine, but I got a statute. So practically, look, I know we're all going to figure out how to handle it, but that's what we deal with in the courtroom, is having two different things that all say different stuff, and the judge has got to figure it out on the fly.
Yeah.
So the ACU's been mad at me. The DA's been mad at me. Kelly wants to add mad mothers against me too.
Get them mad.
Get everybody. Just take everybody on at once.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I get it. I think a lot of the concerns is past. I think the reason why you have the minimum where the judge can't is because past abuses that took place. Frankly, in an era when the court system was less transparent than it is today, right? I mean, there was a time period, I think, when DWIs were sort of just like, yeah, I know the brother-in-law, you don't have to do anything, just show up. But that was a different era. I cannot imagine really that happening today like it did back then. But I think we're still living in that world. And so that's those fines, those minimum fines for the judge was like a way of like locking you into doing what should not have taken place in the 80s.
Right.
And I think I wonder about all that. I mean, we're living in a different era, and we haven't caught up to that era yet. And I think that's going to happen over time. And I have no problem giving the judges their authority on all fines and fees to say it's up to $300, or whatever. Or at a judge's discretion, he can reduce it 15% on the front end. Like none of that stuff. I'm all in for all those things.
And I hear what you're saying, but I also have to take into account the historical aspect of it, and even in looking at the federal system, the reason why they actually have some of these minimums in is to avoid that type of situation, right? Where it's disproportionately put out there based on race,
That's a good point.
your influence, or any other type of thing. You know, you got white guy, good kid, or whatever. Yeah, he was caught with how many pounds of pills, and while we're looking at it up to $5,000 or there's a minimum fine on the drug dealing aspect of it, and he doesn't have to pay it, but yet he's still a black kid. He's hit with it. So I kind of understand from the historical aspect of it too where that came from. So,
But ideally, ability to pay does hopefully address that you can say, I am required to assign you this fine, and then I can determine you are unable to pay. So 260 sort of has that that in it that says, I did everything if it's just checking the boxes, right? I did what I was supposed to do legally under the law. And so for a person who...
And in that case, that's what I'll do. I'll say, all right, this is what it's going to be. We'll come back in 60 days. We'll have a hearing to see where we are as far as that's concerned.
Yeah.
So again, I'm able to move it.
Yes.
And we can do that. 9 times out of 10, though, and what I'm seeing as well is kind of the same thing. A lot of folks, they're paying their fine fees on the front end before we even get to it. And they're just getting it out of the way.
Yeah. And if they can do that, that's not who this is for, right? If that person can say, I just want to be done and out from under it, or the person who quickly off the bat says, yes, I can pay. Okay. But then if the defendant comes back later, or an attorney who's working with this person comes back later and says, look, this person's actually been attached for the last 6 months because they missed a payment hearing. Let me talk to you about why they've missed that payment hearing. They said they could pay. Yes, they really can't. Can we have that conversation now and just bring out the fact that this is actually their reality? Maybe. And I think too, so to the point of like, do we have good data? In Louisiana, the answer right now is not really, right? Like collecting it from a lot of different sources, we don't have consistent labels, we don't have consistent payment methods, we don't have consistent dispersal methods. But if we can look to other states where Texas has done this and acknowledged that collections cost more than what they were bringing in, Alabama Appleseed acknowledged that basically they did almost 1,000-person survey and recognized that the majority of people who are paying criminal fines and fees are actually not in justice involved middle-aged black women, just because they're paying for family, friends, and others. So we know that this is wealth extraction from whole communities. And can we start having that conversation here in Louisiana and hearing that? So it's maybe not a one-off story of this is the outlier, but what is the reality? And then I think, can we also then start building in those questions to have that data? So like, let's take a look and see in 1 year how many ability to pay hearings happened in your courts. What were the determinations? What were the decisions? What were those deciding factors? And then ultimately that balance of, so what was then the impact on the system financially? So I think that matters, and making sure that happens is going to be telling then for what's the next step. Because I think for the other piece too, Act 260 initially had in there the incentive to pay. If you could get on a payment plan, make 12 payments, and then basically say, okay, you did so much, can we waive the remainder so that this does not continue past your 1 year of probation, supervision type thing.
And I'd add to it, and while everybody was talking, we put in the provision that the judge doesn't have to have the Act 260 hearing if he doesn't think it's necessary, without any showing of evidence, but that the judge just had to give reasons why. Because we didn't want the scenario where the judge is like, yeah, we're not doing that. You had and given an appealable right to the person if he feels like he was. But that was all put in there. If in the situation you're talking on the front end, you've done the industry hearing, you know all about the guy, you know that he has the money to pay. There's no reason to have this hearing. I've done everything on the front end. I can say this without the hearing. You owe this. That's the whole provision that you did your job on the front end. That's how I understood it. I think
Is Texas a uniform court system?
I don't believe Texas is.
No.
Florida is, though. We did that too. I've done so much work on this stuff. The task force looked at unified court systems and what that looked like, and we got the
National Council on State Governments.
Thank you to do the report on it and how do we go about getting there. And so we have all the data. Florida did it in the 70s. I think that was like Alabama's done it.
Michigan and Minnesota. Yeah, it was Michigan and Minnesota that were looked at.
Have y'all considered pros and cons then as the legislature and as the advocacy?
I think I personally think it would be amazing to have a unified court system. However, getting there is the roadblocks to that unified court system.
Yeah. I think all those materials are with the task force too, so you can take a look at it. And it was basically I think it was almost 10-year process in Michigan, and that was sort of like what the National Council on State Governments said was to what we could expect if we were to try to move there. And that's why I think from there it also drove, what's the new task force with Z? For the judges, sorry to bring up a touchy subject, but there is.
I'm gonna get up now.
There's part of that was
Make
that.
sure not to bring that up.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but it's part of the conversation in terms of if you're moving to a unified court system, is it the right court system? And so again, being intentional and data driven around. And I think right now they're talking through a work point study. I'm really sorry. I don't go to those meetings. You'll notice you don't see my face in that room. I just listen. But it was what would it take to get us there? And I think Florida and Michigan and Minnesota did it pretty differently. And so of those states, how long it took, what they decided, what the state determined funding was and size was all pretty different. And so I think, again, no one's going to say, here's how you do it, here's your plan. But as an advocate, and to the point of getting clerks on board, standardizing data, standardizing fees and costs, that would just be amazing. Like, as an advocate, that was something I think that I would have, like we've mentioned it and it's come up every time. I don't want to say that we can't make moves until we do that first, right? I want to make sure that we talk about what we can do in spite of not having a unified court system.
And I regretfully brought up Texas earlier on the probation stuff because I hate the Texas-Louisiana comparison. I talk about this a lot when I do like speeches at chambers of commerce, stuff like that, because there's really nothing that makes Louisiana and Texas similar other than we share a border. I mean, if you really like peer back, it's a terrible comparison point. Like, we should always look to South Carolina as a comparable state, similar population size, similar poverty rate, similar minorities, similar agriculture, like shrimping industries. Like, it's like South Carolina should be our basis of comparison. Geographical land sizes, like these are roughly similar states. And we can compare ourselves to Mississippi, but I mean, I don't think that's a comparison worth even diving into.
Yeah.
So, so whether they are unified or not, I don't think should drive our decision, because that's a massive state. I mean, somebody on the western side of that state has very little in common, but Louisiana's not. I mean, I can get to Shreveport in 4 hours from the eastern corner of the state. It's really not this monstrosity of a state. And in the modern world, we should be more connected as a state than we currently are.
There was a 2019 case that the Fifth Circuit decided that it was unconstitutional in Orleans Parish, where the judicial expense funds were made up of more than 25.
I have it on my list. Let's chat.
That's made up of more than 25% of criminal fines and fees. I was wondering, like, if you guys think that could be used, because I feel like that should be binding on all the courts, and if that wouldn't that kind of force, like,
Yeah, so
do you see that being a catalyst?
So the task force started taking up that issue. It started as Act 260, and then that decision came out, and you could read the tea leaves, like that's where the world was going to. And so we started transitioning into looking at that. And that's really where my idea on having an Office of Justice funding also, I thought, solved a lot of problems, because then the judges could be not ordering you to pay to their own courtroom, they could be ordering you to pay the Office of Justice funding, and then that way they're now not, we've created at least a fiction, and I mean in the legal sense, not in the like book, but like where, it's cut out. There's a step in between the two, so they're not directly ordering a fee to their own funding. They're only funding an office that can later will later fund them based off of like aggregate data. So that was like another driver in my decision to do that.
So
But yeah.
we should talk after, but I looked at other courts, like, did like FOIA requests and stuff to like see what percentage other courts' judicial expense.
Oh, so it's going to be through the roof.
Like,
Yeah, it is.
And it's
And
crazy.
everybody has one, and so I think Tanner's point too, when you sit down at the table and say, this is a local bill, it's like, just don't say anything after that. This is a local bill and it's fine. And we have stepped in and trying taking flack and saying, like, you're bringing this local bill that didn't go through Judicial Council. This is a problem. And so we know that we take those hits, but all of your judicial expense funds are local bills. What percentage it makes up, I don't think is the conflict of interest. The conflict of interest comes in how it's being spent. And so in New Orleans, that decision acknowledged that, and I think you can read the decision for yourself, the Kane decision, and determine sort of like what does it mean and how are judicial expense funds being used. We, as part of the task force, were members of a working group to say, okay, if we're being realistic in this, what are some of these fees and costs, not fines? What are the fees and costs that we can start looking at and saying, let's start chipping away and just see what happens? And so what were determined to be unconstitutional conflicts of interest? The public defender fee, your judicial expense funds fees. When presented with the data and what this would mean, the task force was not interested in making those moves until there was data, replacement funding, and the things that went with it. The companion case with Kane was the Calise decision on bail bonds as well, and how that's happening. And so in terms of a legal fiction right now, the Act 110 that moved the money around, as an advocate in our meetings, we call it the money laundering bill. Basically, you're just cleaning the money and moving it in different places. But what we're also unable to figure out right now is what should be done with the money. Right now it's held in escrow by the Orleans Criminal District Court. It's transferred to the city. We've done those same FOIA requests of how much are we talking about? When is it being moved? Where is it in the city budget? And we don't know. I mean, this is the horrifying point right now of it has been transferred allegedly. It is with the city, and the city cannot tell us where it is or what it's doing. So this conversation now needs to be, okay, so if that fee is not going back into the system, which the statute says it should, what can we do with it? And as advocates, we would say, well, if it was unconstitutionally collected, let's return it. Let's give it back to the people. And because of collection systems, we cannot identify the defendants in those criminal cases that paid into the judicial expense fund already. So if we're not going to give it directly back to the people and say, you shouldn't have paid this in the first place, here it is, what's the alternative? And are you instead funding organizations that help with bail bonds fees or getting people to court, or like that's the question. And so is it creating a legal fiction where the money goes someplace else? If we can't track it, I'm not sure I'm going to trust it. Like that's real. And yeah, exactly. So it's what is the judicial expense fund being used for? How is it being used? How is it being collected? And then to the point of, when I pay $100, was that just my Jeff fee, or was 12.5% of that my Jeff fee? And where does that all play out? So I think for us, and what we presented to the task force was, what would be those priorities? And we tried to say, start with the low-hanging fruit. Conflicts of interest and unconstitutionality. And those two, the public defender fee and Jeff fees, felt pretty reasonable for us as an ask. And it just didn't move. It was a non-starter until we know more about all of the things that go into funding the system, which we understand. So if we can get that picture and then come back and say, okay, it costs your court $800,000 to run, you only actually collected, and again too, right, like relying on these fees that are so inconsistently collected is just a problem for the system. But if you only collected $180,000 in 3 years, let's talk about what then the shortfall is in your budget and how we could potentially replace it and pull that off the table. I think too, the next piece is from the task force is all of the people that step in, and I think what is the unconstitutional tax that get head trauma fees, DARE fees, MAD fees, things that are completely disconnected potentially from the system that are actually still also being paid. Or I think too, one really telling hearing that we had was when the testing sites, what is it, the evidence, that they stepped up, crime labs, thank you. Crime labs stepped in and said, all of our funding for this crime lab in North Louisiana comes from the funding of the courts. Like, you cannot take this away. Right. Okay, I'm not gonna disagree with that. Do we have a backlog in testing and evidence and crime labs and everything else? Of course we do. So what does it take for your crime lab to run so that defendants who maybe never even have to send a piece of evidence through your crime lab aren't paying $15 on their court case to fund something that doesn't actually have any direct connection to that case. And I think that's the kind of question that I want to raise. I'm not saying we don't need crime labs, we don't need this, we don't unfund, defund, none of that. That is not our point. It is a question of how much does it cost you to serve the legal system, and what can we then do about it? That it's not coming from somebody where, again, I bounced a check, or I passed a bad check, or I had theft. Nothing goes to the crime lab. Why am I paying crime lab fees? There was no head trauma involved in my case. Why am I paying a head trauma fee? Things like that. I think it's head and spinal or something.
And my view is maybe the similar, but not the same. I'm actually pro fee. But no, for a couple of reasons. I think it's important from an accountability standpoint of the person who's going through the system to realize there's economic consequences for what he did. I'm not pro fee.
Convicted.
Convicted,
Mm-hmm.
yes. I'm not pro fee in the sense that I think it should be exorbitant, and I'm not pro fee in the sense that he should be paying for things that society is a societal obligation that society has shrugged its shoulders on and doesn't want to pay, and so we're going to shrug it off a guy who has no political influence and he has no ability to fight it, and so it's just a convenience matter. Those are where I get my heartburn at, and so. And that's where we are. I mean, and look, this is on the civil side. In Terrebonne Parish, we have a fee for a library, a civil fee. It's on the civil side, a fee for the Terrebonne Bar Association library. Terrebonne Bar Association doesn't have a library. It never had a library. So I was the president, and I got a check for like $1,000 every month that I was just shoving in a bar association account that had like 40 grand in it. And with no idea what to do with it. Like, I'm like, what do I do with this fee? Like, I don't know what to do with it.
Build a library?
Build a library? And nobody wants library books anymore in the legal world? I mean, like, there was no, like, and that was the idea, is that one day that somebody would build a library for the bar association to use, but the times changed, and this was like nobody, I don't even know if DARE's in school anymore. It's like, at least it's not in Terrebonne, but there is a DARE fee. Like, we have all these things that are now unattached to, and look, I don't know that the criminal's supposed to pay for the DARE. I mean, that's a public thing, right? I don't know that it's not associated with his incarceration.
Well, it's kind of, it overlaps a little with Z's task force about, and I heard a lot of his talks about transparency within the judiciary, and kind of, that word always kind of makes my cackles come up, because we are about as transparent as you can be. Our courtrooms are open. I have a budget. We're audited by the legislative auditor. I was like, every year, like, we have our budget that everybody can see, but I understand that every court is all different. One of the things that we've done there is in our clerk's office, on the page, on their website, shows where every dollar that they collect goes. So these are the court costs in these cases, this percentage goes this way and this way. And I think if we can get all our clerks to maybe do that, some of that, you know, with the DARE fees there and all that, you can see it. And once you, like, wait a minute, that might not be right. And I think some of the difference in court costs around the state are there. But Will and I are going to have a local bill come to this session, so we'll sneak in and try to move some.
Is it going to go through to the judicial council?
Yeah, I know.
And I tell you one thing too is,
but I'm going to move from a criminal fee, but put it on the civil side, because we still need to fund our bill, our costs. I mean, we had kind of like the Lafayette deal. We built a new courthouse in Baton Rouge. Everybody's kind of seen it, but you know, we have our bonds out for 30 years, and part of our bonding thing was a certain amount that was tied to a criminal cost. Well, that sunsetted at some point. Well, now our bonding people are like, whoa, and then our rates are going like crazy, so we need to put that back in, but I know we're not going to put it back in at the 260 and put it back on the criminal side, so we've got to figure out a way to put that back in on the civil side. But those things from an economic standpoint, you're moving from one, you're just shifting the cost somewhere else. And I think that when you're taking it off the people, again, policy-wise, I think it's a good call, but those costs don't go away.
I will, to defend my seatmate, because I'll sit next to Z's in the house, as Marcus well knows.
Yeah.
You know, Marcus was there, I think when you were there, when we did LA Checkbook. The state has LA Checkbook, the locals don't. And so, the locals were always anticipated being a part of LA Checkbook, because it isn't, LA Checkbook's based off of Ohio. I'm not advocating for LA Checkbook. I don't think anybody ever goes on LA Checkbook. Like, it's supposed to be a big deal. We're going to make it super transparent, easy to break down this information. And I think 4 people have looked at it since it's been online. But there is I'm not saying every jurisdiction, but there is resistance from. I mean, look, I'll air out a sacred cow in front of everybody. Does anybody want to talk about the DA's PTI program? Do you think that wants to be how you think you want transparency of that piece? And look, I'm not anti-DA in any stretch of the imagination, but if I start sniffing around, let's see how much money is in PTI, I will get ran out. I mean, it's recorded. I'm sure some DAs can call me, I have to get a PTI program. No, I'm not. But like, let's just be honest with one another. That program is run without any transparency or any accountability. I'm not saying it's not a good program, because as soon as I say that, some DA is going to say that I'm anti-pretrial diversion, and that's a great thing this is a good thing. And I'm like, I agree, it's a good thing, but that doesn't mean it can't be transparent. It can't mean that we can't have access to what's going in and out of those programs, how much money is being taken off the table, how much these guys are really innocent that are being put on PTI, and this is like a way of just collecting money from the innocent people who were wrongly accused, because I've seen that.
Pay to play.
Yeah.
Bill this guy's case, they don't have enough
It
evidence.
takes money away from the
Send them over there, it's gonna be too
Yeah.
tough to prosecute.
And it's a it's a CYA program. Like, I should be dismissing this case, but it looks bad, and so I'm mistaking him in
Based on the nature of the charge.
nature of the charge. You get some classes, so nobody can come back on me as the elected official. I mean, we all know what this is. I'm not saying there isn't people who don't. I'm not saying it's a bad program. It's a great program, but we could look at it, right?
Do you have any idea of what the tax, what you were talking about earlier, the tax on medical marijuana, how much could that potentially generate? And how much could it generate? And would that fund a system that people could really kind of have faith in?
Right now, it wouldn't generate enough money because the medical marijuana program has been so slow to get going in the state of Louisiana. It's probably only now getting to a point where it's getting not widely used, is the wrong word, but getting used at rates that other states would see the utilization.
You actually said recreational.
Yeah, I said recreational too. It's either one, medicinal and recreational. So the medicinal side, which is legal, it would just generate a small amount of money at this point. But I always anticipated that as being, you do the medicinal, and then when full legalization, if it happens in the state of Louisiana, that you would have the taxing framework built out. And if you get to full legalization, you're talking crazy money.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Louisiana Progress has, I think, projected like $10 billion. I'm sorry, I think they, over a period of years, and I don't know if it's like 5 to 6 for full rollout because they anticipate several years, but they can put something around $10 billion within the first X number of years. Because again, it'll start slower and then ramp up. And so they've actually proposed and sort of brought legislation, or started the conversation around, if we create this fund, and it's probably related to tech fees or like improving technology in the state, which we also acknowledge in some smaller parishes could be a really big benefit for the court systems, and then also add in like reduction of fees and costs, acknowledging and saying, if New Orleans or if Homa will reduce their fees by X amount of money, this will then replace that, right? And so that way you would have a dollar for dollar match potentially. That's their proposal, Louisiana Progress, if you want to talk to them about it, but it is based fully on legalization and a pretty significant amount of money.
question, big picture. The legislature used to be dominated by lawyers. It's not anymore. And, I always think it's funny, and I think Marcus would even back this up 100%, is like the members have like, oh yeah, all the lawyers, you need to get rid of all the lawyers around here. And as soon as there's any bill that defers to like legal stuff, they'll be like, hey Tanner, how do I vote on this? Can you explain this to me? Show me the thing. I'm like, yeah, you like me around. And then whenever I told them, they took it as gospel. I'm like, this is hilarious. Like, you just, this doesn't make any sense. But the people who actually have a working knowledge of the judicial system in the legislature is a long way of saying is very small. Even a lot of the lawyers that are there they're not
reading.
Yeah.
Tell the truth. 4 out of 5 don't read.
And a lot of their experiences are not courtroom practicing attorneys who have a real deal working knowledge of this is what, or they're frankly guys who are like State Farm attorneys. And no offense to those guys, I used to be one. They don't know. Like, right, they show up at a motion for summary judgment hearing, and that's their conception of, and they saw maybe before them some guys being carried in. They they don't have a real idea of what the judges and the clerks and the sheriffs do on a day-to-day basis. And so my point being is that kind of level of conversation is difficult in that body because of the lack of knowledge, and they're going to default to those stakeholders' positions out the gate and never, well, I don't know, Tanner. You know, he's telling me that this is what's going to happen. It's like, that's not what's going to happen. Like, you know, but that's a long way of me saying, I'm not denigrating them, but that's just what's happened in the legislature structurally, you know, over the last 30 years. And then attorneys like Marcus leave and we get somebody else who's not an attorney.
It's a lot of influence, and then I think too to the point of like, while courts are extremely transparent and have to turn in and be audited in all these ways, what we're finding is when sheriffs are doing the collections, that's where the Supreme Court has actually really struggled to get good data. And so when there isn't transparency from other offices, we don't have enough necessarily to back up and say, well, my sheriff told me da-da-da-da-da. I can't say that's wrong as an advocate.
And I give you an example of this. So when we first started this, Jefferson Parish and Ansardi and Judge Slagle were very like, we do everything, we know everything, let me show you. And the legislative auditor came back with a spreadsheet on Jefferson Parish alone that showed all the things they did not know about Jefferson Parish. And what reality was, they knew this part of the courthouse. The judge, the very like intel, like that's, I know where my judicial expense fund is going. Like, I know this, I know that. They weren't lying to me. They believed it to be true. They just didn't know what they didn't know. And when the legislative auditor went in there, they found out, well, look, the sheriff has collected $1 billion, and you got $20 million. You don't know if that $20 million was owed to you or not. It could have been $100 million. You don't know that, and we don't know that because we don't have auditing measures across the system. And that was the big takeaway, was that Jefferson Parish we thought was going to be the best one to give us reliable data on this because of all of what the infrastructure they had built around their accounting, and they were probably the best in the state at that point. And to give Lake Charles an example, I hate to throw anybody under the bus, but you know, back then the former DA DeRozier made a big deal about all the money he collected from victims. Auditing his books based on legislation, he gave $200 a year recovered for victims. Now, what did I learn from that? Either he wasn't doing it at all and he didn't care about victims, which I find that hard to believe, or there was insufficient auditing measures to show what he was truly recovering and reflecting that in his books for victims. It was being put somewhere else, but wherever it is, it showed up as $200. So when he's coming to the Act 260 hearing, he's like, this is all about recovering for victims. It's like, I never said it publicly and out loud. Like, dude, your book showed $200. Like, but I mean, that's kind of where you are.
And I think we are probably wrapping up. So I will also say, I think for me looking forward, any information, any data is always going to be good. It's not good. We get plenty of bad data. But I think any information and as much information as we can get is always more helpful than less. And it's going to make these conversations more meaningful, more concrete, and then actually give the legislature or advocates the ability to craft better policies, right? And so I think from that, felonies were a great starting point. And I'm sorry, Tanner, it's always one more thing. But the majority of folks in the state don't have those felonies. It's your misdemeanors and your traffic tickets. And so how can we continue to start from this wonderful place? Act 260 has been implemented. We have waited 5 years for this. It deserves all the celebration and accolades to Tanner to get this across the finish line. I think, though, from an advocate perspective, just understand and expect that we will always ask, thank you, that's great, what's next? And I would challenge you guys as well to say, just because that person got convicted of a misdemeanor doesn't suddenly mean they can pay too, right? And so where within your discretion and your capacity can you always say, let me take into consideration this person's current situation, status, whatever it is, and how can I potentially work with them? Because ultimately, end of the day, we know, and again, if you want to look up that Alabama Appleseed report, they acknowledge something like, I think, 82% of their respondents said they gave up on necessities to pay court costs. And they acknowledged that something around, I think it was over 50%, but I didn't write this part down because it was also like, I don't know if I want to share that, but about 50% of their people, I believe, acknowledged that they potentially committed some other crime to pay for the court costs. And so if we're talking about a public safety thing that we can actually hang our hats on, if we can make this reasonable and feasible for people, are we actually improving outcomes and improving public safety? And I think that fines and fees should never be connected with the public safety conversation in terms of, and I don't know, Tanner took a hit on this when running for judge last year, but that he was like not tough on crime and not, and really putting public safety at risk. That is the lie, and that is the narrative that we have to start shifting, is that someone's ability to pay is not connected to, or should not be connected to, whatever their choices are, whatever their recidivism may or may not be. And I think that's just like, the lawyers and the economists need to kind of get together and have that conversation. So, I don't know, you probably have closing thoughts as well. So
No, that's great.
I know-
I'll end on a high note.
Yeah.